have a few comments. The first is about Hamlet. Hamlet was published in 1603-ish, right after this Alexander Ruthven event, and it was very popular in Germany. It wasn't played, Hamlet by William Shakespeare. It wasn't played in England until 1619 in front of the king, King James. And I believe in 1619, Shakespeare had already died at that point. Last time I talked about bone surgery and serology, and I want to emphasize the logical point I'm making. So if you go and look on YouTube, and I did a search for Joseph Smith bone surgery, here's a medical doctor. You wonder who funds these different websites. These are Mormon funded. The church has funded them somehow. Joseph's Miracle Run. I think about him running through the woods with 60 pounds of gold later in life with a limp. This is the video I uploaded. This typhoid fever video talks about how they probably stabbed him in the left shoulder and actually cut him so the pus would ooze out, and they would examine the pus and try to make a determination. That's the basis of my argument. The serology argument is basically saying you can't examine the pus and have any idea what's going on. And so that was a medical doctor in the 1930s. So if there's a medical doctor listening to this and wants to say, no, the Mormon view is correct. I watched this video, and he brings out a little 7-year-old to help you understand how small the boy was. And he kind of goes through the procedure to some degree, but he doesn't get at the heart of the issue. A doctor is saying you cannot examine that pus to determine whether or not you should have cut out that bone, which is my major thesis. And then, since we're looking at YouTube rankings, this is a virgin account of mine, an Alma account, if you will. Alma means virgin likely means virgin in Hebrew. Who killed Joseph Smith? There's some conspiracy theories that maybe they killed themselves with their pistols, or John Taylor killed him. I didn't watch this video about this leg operation. So, behind the mask, meet an orthopedic surgeon, nothing to do with Joseph Smith. The leg surgery, orthopedic surgery, pastor's honest thoughts on Joseph Smith. People also watch the Carthage conspiracy. So clickbait sells, and so the title I used was intentionally clickbait. I'm going to use some very interesting titles as we move forward that may offend many, but clickbait sells. And if you want to get the word out, you got to find these people. So a response to who killed Joseph Smith, and then you got the hip antis out there. Top thing Mormon missionaries won't tell you about Joseph Smith. And then you got a tibial nail system. So this is what happens when you break a bone. A lot of people, when they shatter their ankle, they get all these screws and plates put in their ankles. And you think about what we're told with the crucifixion, and you're like, you're a religious believer that they drove nails into the ankles or feet of Yeshua, but it's okay to do that from a medical point of view. Things they hid about Joseph Smith, they won't tell you. I want to comment a little bit on this. John Dehlin got his PhD studying why people leave the Mormon Church. Part of me thinks that he has to. I think he has a good heart. He's well-intentioned. He's very much seething the hypocrisy of the leadership. But there's a lot of internal hypocrisy with what he does. He only presents certain people on his show. He deletes some of the videos. There are some concerns that he hasn't been fully honest and true about some of his dealings. There was this woman, Rosebud or something, and his response would be, well, my lawyers told me not to. Well, that's what the Mormon leaders are dealing with every day. Their lawyers are telling them not to say anything. So, top thing was Mormon missionaries. And then this girl, she lived the dream growing up in Provo, so her idea of a hard time as a Mormon is she had to walk across the street. I think they still had to walk across the street to go to seminary. She didn't have to get up early or doing that. Was Brigham part of the... I don't know. That's really irrelevant to the bigger issues. We can live in fear all we want, talk about conspiracies. I think it's Timothy somewhere. God didn't give us a heart or a spirit of fear, but of faith. And I was thinking a little bit about David and Goliath. David shows up to bring food for his brothers. He's told this story that if you kill Goliath, you get a bunch of money. And he's like, I'm in. And then what he says after he finds out about the payment is, of course our God can defeat him. And that's where faith comes from. And it's written in the histories by Jews that it's our God and he's all powerful and he's the most high God. There is a most high God. He isn't owned by the Jews. He isn't owned by the Mormons. He is owned by no one. And so, look at Brahma and Shiva and Vishnu. I believe they think Brahma is the most high God. They have thousands of gods. They have divas and devis or whatever. So as we talk about n and n plus 1, we need to look and understand that these writers are interpreting what they're reading. And I think about Lehi, in Spanish, which means I read. His spiritual journey is he read a book and he went to the islands. He went to the islands, meaning the lands away from. And all of that's easily seen in the Spanish language. And then there's a verse in Isaiah for lo and behold, or lo somehow means no as well, like the negation. There's one that says Lai, and Lai in Hebrew means to the islands. But anyway, one of my favorite verses growing up, my favorite verse growing up was "Oh, be wise, what more can I say?" But one of the Book of Mormon masteries was Adam fell that men might be, and men are that they might have joy. You go a few verses up, you have to look at the context. So the first context, so let's go up. So I think it's Genesis 49. Why don't you use the Mormon tools? Well, the Mormons had good tools. This website's really, really good. There's some things they can improve on. They're evangelical, so they won't include apocryphal and other books. I've tried to use eSword and logos and stuff. We need to build a tool that is like this, that does interlinear of whatever document you create, lets you go to the original document if you have it. So Joseph is a fruitful vow. This one right before is very interesting. And it says, we never read the next two verses, but he gets several verses here, more so than the other brothers. And I think in the book of Lehi, the entire blessings of Jacob were in there. So it wasn't just one line for Reuben or whatever. It was the entire blessing. And it says Joseph, Ben, son, Pada. I forget what that word is. Ben, Pada, Ben, by a Ayin. Ayin's a well or a fountain. Could mean eye. whose branches bat his daughters run over the wall. And you can go and listen to how these words are pronounced. So let me jump into fruitful to remember what this is. Yeah, so fruitful could mean industrious. It doesn't necessarily mean bearing children.
Strong's H 6509. Para. Para.
Paraná. How many words in Brazil have the word para in it? Parana. So the Shura word is interesting because it's actually pronounced shore.
Strong's H 7791. Sure.
And when we get in and start talking about Shazer, so Shazer, Nehem, or however you want to pronounce it, and bountiful are three cipher words. So if you want to get all mysterious and get all national treasure on the project, Nephi leaves three cipher words. And I'm going to eventually talk about these as being super words. And Sheol is one of them. Seir is another. You have to understand how they're traveling and what's going on. There's a wall of mountains. So as they cross the Red Sea, Moses led them across the Red Sea. There's some debate where that was. It's probably Nuweiba is where the crossing was. Most people want to say it's further south because the water's less deep, but there's coral there, so that'd make it more difficult to cross. At Nuweiba, some people have scuba dived and supposedly found coral that shouldn't be there because that means there's something foreign that the coral grew on, and some of them look like chariot wheels. And it's very deep there. And if I recall, they're crossing the Red Sea into Midian, and it's a headwind. But what's interesting, if you do the longitude and latitude, either crossing is exactly at a latitude. The southern potential crossing is exactly 28 degrees north. The northern crossing is exactly 29 degrees north. So that's very interesting. And, the Great Pyramid of Giza or Khufu or whatever we want to call it, if that's the architect, is 30 degrees north. So anyway, they said they have this headwind, and right when they get to the other side, there's a wall of mountains. And I believe that's what this is, Shura means. And so when Nephi talks about likening the scriptures unto us, and greater are the words of Isaiah, he's telling you Isaiah foretold of a family that would leave, go to a place where people didn't value gold and precious things. The obvious one is turning swords into plowshares. And we're supposed to believe that in the 1800s, someone built the metal plowshare and changed the world. Isaiah in 700 BC is talking about turning swords into plowshares. They already had metal plowshares to cut the earth. So one of the things I think about, and this is very important as we continue, is when you analyze something, you also have to analyze what's missing. And the Soviets, when they would develop innovation, they would build a matrix. They say, this is what we have, this is what we have. And they would decompose it into characteristics, and they'd build a grid. And they would have empty squares in the grid, and they're like, this is what's missing. So in this puzzle about Nephi, because we don't have the story of Lehi, we have enough. We have sufficient. And there was a good book written about, what was contained in these missing pages. I don't want to say 116 pages. There weren't 116 pages. There was a book of Lehi. There was something that I would call something like, whatever the word for fruitful was, industrious. talking about this era of living in a manner of happiness and the industry involved there and the growing of the cities and towns and communication and travel and shipping by boat and all of that. And then there were wars, and then there was the Moses of the Ea, the Moses of the land of the waters, who traveled through mountains to save the pure blood line of Nephi, and then to connect to the rest of the industrious world. So they were trapped. They were surrounded in the geographical circumstances that they had. And so Moses, Ea, led his people. And so there's going to be a section in these missing pages about the Exodus. And then obviously there's something about Amenadi. There's more detail about Zenos and Zenek. So this goes into how Yeshua was killed upon a tree. I'm not going to use the word crucified because that brings in all of our baggage of our history and it doesn't go to the truth. There is a truth there. So Joseph is a fruitful bough, even a fruitful bough by the well. And then you can read this, and this is where I wish they would do septilinear. I wish they would put word by word. The Septuagint, the Masoretic text was written about 1000 AD, and why, what motivated it. If you look at the words, they're missing words. So maybe they were losing their language, and this was their attempt to try to preserve it. But the Masoretic text is what we call the Bible. But the academics that worked for King James in the 1600s, in 1611 when the book was published, they had the Masoretic text, they had the Septuagint, and they had other resources. And in this case, when I've done the study here, and you look at these words, there's nothing about a well or boughs or anything. But why did the English put it in their version? It's because they had some information, or they had an understanding of what a tree of life would be. There's no mention of a tree here. This is a metaphor of a tree. It's not here. So maybe they had an older version of the Hebrew, but the older version of the Hebrew didn't have it. So how did that become part of the English tradition? And that's part of the question here. And so fundamentally, if you want to unlock and discover the knowledge of Jehovah, I'm talking about surgery before. What we do is we stake the fish. So if you kill a fish and you cut it in horizontal pieces, you have steak. Or you can fillet the fish, which just means you cut it lengthwise. You try to avoid the bone and just get the flesh. So when I ask the question about surgery, that should be an easy question. You just pivot. You're just like, let's look at all the data historically across all cultures about the history of surgery, the evolution of surgery in human history. It's not easy to do. And it's not easy to do because no one's taken the time to organize the data so you could pivot off of all of the data and then pivot off of a topic or a question. So Genesis 49:22 was a scripture mastery. I was a freshman in high school when we had the Old Testament. And at that time, they had 40 scripture masteries out of the Old Testament. And my point is Jacob probably gave blessings to each of the sons. It was probably recorded. And this is a synopsis. Now, recall that an abridgment of Lehi was made by Nephi. And then Mormon either just put that abridgment in or made his own abridgment from either the original abridgment or Nephi's abridgment. And so things get shorter. And so I wish I had a good Book of Mormon search tool. Let's see what Let's see how good this one is. So I'm going to search for the word suppose. So we talk about 25. Adam fell that men might be. This looks like that's a nice website. It's got some commentary. Adam fell that men might be, and men are that they may have joy. And then he goes off and says, and I suppose they wouldn't have had children. And then he trails off. Are you still talking? And he's like, I've chosen the good part. So Lehi is swimming in deep waters. He's the one that read the book. He probably lived a upper middle class lifestyle. Probably wasn't real religious, but he practiced the ceremonies, and then something happened to change his life. And what triggers something to change your life is going to be a massive astrological event that gets you thinking. And then he had a vision with some pillar of fire or something, or it could have been related to the astronomical visions. So verse 17, prophets are not omniscient, omnipresent, etc. God is. He's making suppositions based on what he reads. This is a fundamental principle of understanding God's word. I remember when Jacob found out that Joseph had died, and they showed him the coat of many colors. Translation, there's no color reference at all in the original language, but it captures our attention. Does Jacob rent that coat or rent his own garment? And then later when he finds out Joseph is alive, it says his heart leapt inside of him. Okay, if you know anything about literature, how can an objective third-person party know that his heart leapt inside of him? So he could have written a narrative, a biography, and said, my heart leapt inside of him. And there was probably a promise made with Joseph. So here in verse 17, Lehi tells us he's supposing. This is why the words of Nephi are so important. They're going to unlock all of the keys to understand what's going on in a bigger context. Prophets make lots of suppositions. Embedded prophets make a lot of reactionary suppositions. So if you look at the time of Lehi and Jeremiah was the prophet. They had a school of elders, school of prophets, school of prophetesses. You can read that with Hezekiah when they discover some of possibly the plates that they stole and left town with, the records of their people. And it says many prophets arose. And some of the prophets said, these signs don't mean anything. We're going to be appeased. And some of them saw them ominous that the city would fall. And it started with a sign of heaven. That's what triggers people. Why do you think Samuel the Lamanite showed up? There was a sign in heaven and no one knows. Nephi is the prophet. Nephi is given the sealing power. And he doesn't know what the signs mean. So Samuel the Lamanite gets on a wall. Everyone hates him. He tells them the stories. He tells them exactly what's going to happen. A bunch of signs occur. One of them is Jesus is born. More signs occur. And then during the life, there's so many signs that just say, whatever. There's so many signs in the heavens. So if you want to talk about the birth of Jesus, you've got to start with some astrology or astronomy. I don't care what word you use. And we get into today's topic. That's a problem with some of what's going on. So Lehi is trying to mimic what Jacob did because Lehi probably had read the full blessings, and those full blessings were probably part of the record. So let's look at some notes before. So the whole tangent of the YouTube rankings. this is a virgin account. They're putting a lot of anti-material out there. "34 wives." 34 wives. I thought he originally had 27. Yeah, the 200 pounds, the weight of the plates. So anyway, there's a default anti-Mormon ranking layer of the algorithm. So I'm doing bone surgery, and it gets into all sorts of things. So the Mormon Church is fighting this propaganda, and then you have hurt Mormon culture people that are, what do they want? They want an apology. They want to hear, "We love you." It's so interesting to, see if they're just doing it to monetize themselves, which would be kind of ironic. So the bone surgery argument is, if you were to cut Joseph's left shoulder or whatever, which is what one of those other videos explained happened, and the pus came out, and you were to examine the pus, the study of serology is the study of that pus. There's no way of determining whether or not you should cut a bone. That's what the doctor of 1939 said. I want to talk a little bit about cognitive dissonance. At some point, you have to realize that the father of all lies rules this earth, and you live in a world of lie. And you need to waste and wear out your life to bring the truth out of the darkness. And how do you do that? You're going to face cognitive dissonance. It's not easy. So I told this story of this emergency C-section and the possibility that the doctors were tacitly colluding to make more money for themselves and for the hospital. And I remember a woman hearing this story. She told about her first birth, which turned into an emergency C-section. And she told how she was in bed and the nurses were out there whispering to each other, and then one would come in and say something, then they'd go back out and whisper to each other, and another would come in and say something, and they convinced her to get a C-section. And I think it struck her that, maybe I was played. But that's just so hard for her to deal with. She denied, "No, that couldn't have been it. They saved my son's life." And that's the problem with cognitive dissonance, is how do you move past it? And the easiest way to move past it is through meditation. This idea that we live in a dream, we live in a simulation, to prove them herewith if they'll do everything. Joseph once said that if we knew how great the worst kingdoms on the other side of heaven, the worst mansions, the worst orbs, whatever he meant by that, we'd all kill ourselves, suicide. And recently the brethren come out, make it very clear, don't kill yourself. So they're just clinging to the rod. They don't know what's going on. They don't know how to interpret things. Or maybe they do, and I'm just out of the loop. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about times and seasons. When was Messiah born, aka Yeshua or Jesus? The church needs to bear his name. His name wasn't Christ. Christ is a Greek word meaning anointed. If you take the T out of Christ, you get Christos, which means gold. I really have a hard time believing that gold or anything sounding close to gold would be in the true name of the Messiah. We always had this argument about Xmas versus Christmas. If you go back to the King James Bible, the original, they would have what's called an XT Mass. So a Mass for XT. And as I've thought about that, and that's going to lead to some of the conclusions I'm currently making, X could have been Chi, which is a Greek letter. It looks like the Aleph or the A, the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and supposedly Tav is the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet. So to say I'm the beginning and the end, the Alpha and Omega in Hebrew would be the Aleph and Tav. Aleph is an ox in the oldest language. So let's pull up Hebrew. So the order of the Hebrew alphabet comes out of a psalm. So if we believe that psalm, there's only 22 letters, and this is the graphic I really like. So you need to understand the evolution of languages. Hebrew comes from a Proto-Sinaitic root, which the Phoenicians are given credit for the first alphabet, but who knows how that played out exactly. So they took whatever Egypt had in terms of language, which was pictorial, logographs and phonetic sounds, and they took what the Assyrians or the Babylonians had, the Akkadians, Sumerians, that were based on wedge shapes carved into clay, but mostly out of Egypt from what I understand. So, for example, this thing that looks like water is Ma'im, the letter M. It's kind of in the middle of the alphabet. So you can see that. The first letter, ox, Aleph, it's supposedly silent, but sometimes it's not. It's a vowel. You're not supposed to have any vowels. The other vowel is the ayin, the I. We talked about that meaning well of water. It's sort of a vowel. And so these were the first characters. So like this Proto-Sinaitic you can find in South Arabia. So they found the word Ishmael on a rock in South Arabia. And they don't have chain of evidence on the archaeology, and they know Mormons are out there looking for some of these clues. So you wonder how legitimate that finding is. But this is one of the symbols, and it's probably rotated 180 degrees. So just looking at the symbols, these are all distinct. I could read and see these. This one is interesting. Sun Shemesh. That's not what some people think the original meaning was. The original meaning was two round mounds with a line underneath it to represent the breasts of a woman. This one's obviously what we call the Greek cross. It's also in the Chinese languages the number 10, and it's supposed to be the last letter. So when he says, I am the Aleph and the Tav, I am the beginning and end, in the 1611 King James Bible, that's where the XT Mass came from, Christmas, Xmas. It was the Aleph, because the symbol for the Aleph, this looks kind of like an X, and the Tav, the T. They wouldn't have written the Hebrew for that, so they would have written something like a T. So you got something like the Chi and the T. Some of these symbols are interesting. I haven't seen this chart before. Anyway, so EM means mother. AB, a house with an ox inside, so maybe ox is actually the father figure. MAB is actually a rearrangement of those same letters, combining them. So when it says honor your father and your mother, it says ab et em. Et in Latin means and, we say. But et apparently originally meant with or and. So it would be honor your father with the mother. So the father is with the mother. Remember, the man needs to leave his parents and cleave unto his wife. The patriarchy may be inverted. I don't know that. This water symbol is the letter N as in Nancy in Egyptian. So when we talk about Nephi's name being Nephi, is it Maphi? Is he the mafia? So it's really hard. So like this is supposed to be a sword. It looks like a scimitar. This is supposed to be a snake. Each one of these represent them. One of them represents a fish, Dagon, the Dagon god. Yeah, this is the one that I've used a lot. And there's another one you can download that kind of shows the evolution of them. So this is the Aleph. They go this way. Well, they now go this way. Sometimes the Egyptian hieroglyphs sometimes go right to left to right, up to down, up to down. And then some of these old writings they find, they go in all sorts of directions. So the notation of saying it goes from right to left may not be real. Now imagine you're writing this, and imagine there's rotation errors, you're dyslexic. Look at the nature of the Daleth and the Va. They look similar to the untrained eye. And then the Cheth is the Daleth, look at it, with an extra leg. And then you have a mem, unless it ends a word and then it closes off to kind of say it's finished. You have the shin or the sha sound. And this means, like if we look at these words in relation to the death of the Savior, you got a young gentle bull in a house, you got a camel, you got a door or a pathway of life to show or to reveal, a nail, peg, or hook, or a stake of wood, a sword, a fenced chamber, snake, a hand. So look at this symbol for Yod, the hand. And this is part of supposedly Jehovah. People say Yahweh. I really struggle with that conclusion. Look at that. It's a smaller size. It's almost like this Yod character is on top of the Nun, and on top of the Mem, and on top of the Va and the Gimel. It's like the Yod character is everywhere. The Yah character, the Son of God, Yahweh, Jehovah. A shortened version of his name was actually Yah. So we got a palm. Does that have anything to do with the crucifixion? Staff, water, fish, twisting. Remember, shazar, meaning to twist. Ks. Is it sazer? Mispronounced. The eye, the mouth. Is this the Z sound? The back of the head, the highest, most important. So we're supposed to believe that the organ inside the head was considered worthless to these ancients, when head means the highest, most important. Teeth, ivory, and tav. I'm going to pause for 1 second. So I'm looking for this Jeff Benner. I'm looking for his website. So people really try to explain the Hebrew language, and I think the Hebrew language has gone through a stage of lacking, and maybe that was the purpose of the Masoretic text, was to preserve the language. So this is he has a poster you can buy that shows kind of some of the derivations of the words. This is the one that I like. So Aleph is clearly like a cow. And a cow is clearly revered in Egypt and India and other places. The ox, I think we'll talk a little bit about that today. Water, this one means sweat, like sweat of the brow. It's got a zera in it without the R. Might be, Zarahemla might be one of these super words. Tav means good. Somewhere, they have like 3 T sounds, which is really odd. Look at this. Your hands raised above your head, hand outreached. You can look at some of these symbols, and they evolve over time. So the sha sound, female breast. Sha is much easier to say than s. Look how much further you have to go up in your tongue with the s versus sh. You know, you think about how a child learns language. They first say ah, which could be aleph, or could be, you know, I don't know this language. I'm studying this language as a newbie, or ayin. And what's almost the first universal word that baby says is ma. Put the lips together and say this ah sound you've been saying all the time you've been crying. And so if you look at the ease of pronunciation, God's language is going to be easy. Suffer that young children come unto me, for such is the kingdom of heaven. We've created these confusing languages. And who did the confusion at Babel? Was it the wicked one, or was it Jehovah himself? So the other thing we can do is look at south. So when you look at these symbols, it's really hard to understand what's going on. But like in Chinese, ni hao ma, I don't know how well I'm saying that. That means how are you? Apparently in Chinese, ma has like 10 different intonations. You can say it wrong. It's just M-A, and you can say it wrong. So if you look at these maps of all these languages, what are the most simple sounds? So as you try to read, you know, Joseph said that. We have enough data, Joseph said at his time, to rebuild the languages. Now imagine how much data we have now. We just need some Rosetta Stones. Muhammad, the great prophet of Islam, Shalom, said he was the last brick in the wall. He was the last prophet. And there was a 1,200-year drought before Joseph's. And from his perspective, he was the last prophet. Whether or not Joseph, you know, the Islamic faith aren't going to say Joseph Smith was a prophet. And so you have to have that lens. Joseph said the Book of Mormon is the keystone of our religion. The Rosetta Stone wasn't classified as a keystone yet. They were still, in 1832, I think, the guy that figured out the cartouche to help decipher the Egyptian died at a very young age. The Rosetta Stone was discovered like 1799, 1800 by the French. The Rosetta Stone helped unlock language. But think about the word shazer, bountiful, Nephim, or Nahum, Zarahemla. These are markers. These are, in ancient Hebrew, they had super words that could tell the whole story. And it was based on anagrams of that word or derivations of that word with very common words that a child could play a game like fi-fa, fo-fa-fa, fi-fa. You know, it's just natural in our language, in our minds to be able to do that. So we have these different alphabet symbols. You know, if this doesn't look like a Mormon temple ceremony element, I don't know what would. You know, oh look, two arms. We have the arm extended. Anyway, we'll get into this in more detail, but when Nephi says, I, Naphi, having been born of good parents, and I say Naphi, there's some debate about Nephi, Naphtali, and at the time of Joseph Smith, if you go and look up in the 1828 dictionary, you look up Naphtali and you look at the Catholic pronunciation, it was Naphtali. And I would say Naphtali is easier to say. And if you get rid of the tal out of Naphtali, you get Nephi. Naphi. Tal is the Hebrew word for arrow. He put his bow and arrow and his sword down, and he farmed. Certainly his people fought to defend and protect the people. He was a shield for the people. And all those words are in Hebrew. And it's amazing to me that the Mormon Church has not translated 1st and 2nd Nephi into Hebrew. I think that would unlock a lot. And I may start doing that. About 2 years ago, I translated 1st and 2nd Nephi into what I call basic English, 7th grade reading level English, so a child could understand it. And that was a huge learning opportunity. And my ideas are evolving since then. But, when we talk about Isaiah being so important, and everyone just skips over it. And when you think about the clues of Isaiah, you look at what's there and what's missing. Chapter 1's missing. In the 1500s, they have this Deuteronomist belief about who wrote Isaiah. Is chapter 1 missing because it was later written by someone else? Or is chapter 1 so important that Nephi didn't include it to send a message? I didn't include it. And we have the genealogy and name of Isaiah. And in Nephi, he talks about the church, and the church needs to carry the name of God. Maybe the name of God is what we call Isaiah, which is very close in one of the pronunciations to Yeshua. Okay. So, there's a lot of information out there. I'm gonna, just focus on one article. It says 4 BC. So it's good to get to the answer. So let's start where we were yesterday with Joseph Smith. So the year 1805, December, Joseph Smith would have been what's called a wood ox, based on the Chinese calendar. An ox. How would they know about an ox? So let's take these characters. The Z character, I think, is like I, the word I, like I am. So, the secret lies with Charlotte, and Charlotte is China. So second, and I'll explain that in a second. And it's the second of the 10 heavenly stems. It's a turning stroke. It's related to the number 2 or the letter B. Second party in a legal contract. The second party. And then we have not a double-edged sword, but 2 single-edged swords. Knife and 2. The number 2, knife. We can click through to see that. A single-edged sword, a cutlass. And it means shameful, ugly, disgraceful. The year of the ox is the ugly, disgraceful year. The disgrace of man when God was born. Maybe when he died. We get into some of the math. It's going to be when he was born. 2 knives, not a double-edged sword. So this is like, what movie was that? Denzel was in, The Book of Eli, or where he's carrying these two machetes, blind as a bat. The problem with that movie is a Braille Bible is like 40 regular size Bibles. And then we have this, which just kind of means year. One bend out of 10. The line, they call it a line, but it's definitely vertical. This is going to heaven. 10 is 1. Remember, 1 is across, and the line going up. So if you take 1 and you go to heaven, you get 10. Definitely a decimal system there. And it means year. So one bending of the sun. And so to understand this, you need to understand that there were 12 animals, supposedly in the Chinese astrology, and there were 5 earth elements. And there's a 60-year cycle that likely aligns. So the rat is the first sign, and then the ox, and it loops. And then there's a common element that it's tied to by nature, but there's a 5-year wheel that goes with this 12-year wheel, which creates a 60-year cycle. So you can see the flow of those based on when you were born. And so going back to Joseph Smith, he was a wood ox. And the story goes that there was a race among the animals. And the ox was clearly going to win, but he let the rat, whether it's on his horn or on his head, tag along. And at the very end, the rat either cheated to win or the ox let him win. So the rat won the race when the ox should have won the race. And, you see tiger there. Why wouldn't a tiger outrun an ox? I don't know for sure, but that's kind of the story. Do we have the story of a precursor to the ox that declares that he's unworthy? The cousin of Yeshua, unworthy to tie his shoes. I wonder if it was unworthy or unable to, like incapable, like physically not able. So there we have 1805. Joseph Smith was a wood ox. Now I'm going to do 7 BC, which is my proposition for the birth of Jesus. Apparently I did 1 BC. 7. So this is assuming everyone's doing their calendar interpolations correctly. But we have the water ox in 7 BC. That's interesting. That would suggest it's now 8 BC. This used to be to the water ox. I've done this a few times. Let's do 8 BC. So this is why you have to look at things a little bit blurry. So it depends on when the year changes, and the year changes around February, March. So I don't have a problem going to 8 BC based on the counts. So 8 BC, when was the most recent water ox? So in Mormonism, we have this 600-year cycle thing that we get out of a prophecy. So here's a water ox. The most recent water ox was 1973. The next cycle of the water ox is 60. 1973 plus 60. The year 2033. You do cycles. This 2033 is also the 33rd cycle of 60 since 8 BC. Note the time, 55:27. Okay, so we have in the glyphs an ox, a water. Oh, this other glyph is probably better. Where was another glyph? This was a nice graphic. So it shows the evolution of the letters. This was a nice graphic. I hadn't seen this before. So along this diagonal, we have ox, water, tav. Remember, tav is a cross. It's the number 10. You take those letters in Hebrew, and you get the word emet. Emet means truth. When Yeshua says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, he says emet. He says he's the ox, the water ox that brings the cross. Okay, so let's now piece that together with some other data. I'm going to probably pause this. So Chadwick, who's not anywhere near an astrophysicist, has written a paper called Birth of Ghosts. And this gives us a Mormon perspective. So we have constraints in Mormonism that are different than constraints of Christians that are trying to find this. And everyone believed in a 1 BC birth. This is a good start. He also has a paper on Lehi that I need to go through and kind of critique. He's a hard read. I've sent him a note about Iriantum. I found some stuff related to that. Iriantum's another one of these. It's not a super word of the Hebrew. It's a word to unlock some of the mysteries. So Chadwick, I have a hard time reading him. Mormon culture is so close. I don't know him. No direct connection. But there's 1 degree of separation between anyone in Mormon culture. And I probably have 3 or 4 friends that directly know him. So he's going to go through the birth of Christ. He's going to go through some of the traditional stuff about the timing. He apologizes way too much because he's basically challenging the brethren. This is men making interpretations of Scripture throughout time. April 6th, there's a lot of people challenging that, and we'll get to that in a second. It's interesting you mentioned John P. Pratt. He recently passed away, a good guy. He did a lot of calendar studies. He's more of a calendar geek than I'll ever be. But he was just missing some simple clues what was missing. So, like if I had to rank these, I would put Orson at the beginning. Orson Pratt knew Hebrew. He was given an award by the teacher. Joseph Smith was given a participation award. Orson Pratt would debate people about Hebrew at Brigham's request. Joseph sees Egyptian papyri, wants to learn Hebrew. What's the template or temple there for us as followers? Brigham creates a random alphabet called the desert alphabet. Learn Hebrew, learn Chinese, learn Arabic. Any one of those would have benefited the church more. Just imagine if we were learning any one of those languages. So the first thing he concludes here is 4 BC. You do the readings that he's reading that I've read. There's one book that says it could have been 4 or 5 BC. And I'm a 5 BC guy, meaning the death of Herod the Great. Herod the Great was a monster. Augustus Caesar once said it would be better to be a pig in Israel than to be a child of Herod the Great, because he killed all those children. Every time he killed a child, he had to get permission from Rome, even though he was kind of the Roman leader of the area. And then after his death, the kingdom split up to, 4 kingdoms or something. Philippi was the one of most interest, Herod of Philippi or something. But then they put Pontius Pilate, a Roman person, as the final say. So we're supposed to believe that Herod Philippi had a girl dance, and as a result, he just cut off John the Baptist's head and presented it to her. And he didn't need permission, but he needed permission to kill Yeshua. Anyway, there's some there's some illogical components of the story. So the death of Herod, it's pretty interesting that his death was related to a lunar event. And then this is the problem with academics. The only lunar event. If you were a physicist, you would never say that because you understand that there's so much we don't know. There's a margin of error there. So then he's going to look up lunar eclipses. So let's do that real quick. So let's go. I'm building a spreadsheet to make this easier to search. NASA lunar eclipses. So I pretty much have the lunar eclipse page done. I got to do the solar eclipses so I can do the other. So, they calculate, assuming nothing interfered with the rotations of the sun, Earth, and Moon forever. 5,000 years. Where is that? There it is. It's one of these two. Catalog. Canon, maybe? There it is. No. There it is. Okay, so let's go to about something BC. So we're looking for a T here. This would be a total lunar eclipse. And then it has a place called zenith where it's easiest to see in the sky. And so he's saying September 15th of 5 BC. So we did that math correct. So there's no here zeros, zeros -1 or 1 BC. So this one was a total eclipse, September. So you click on it, a total eclipse. You see that? It's going right through the center. It's right in the wheelhouse. I don't have a problem with that prediction. We have one that's just a few months sooner, also in the area, which means, that first one was right there. Like if I go back, it doesn't let me go back. It loses the history. So, to me, those are the candidates. It's a blood moon, meaning the Earth is blocking the sun, shadows from hitting the full moon, so it goes dark, and then the atmosphere of the Earth somehow lets some light through, and it turns into a blood moon. So he's pretty accurate there. But if he goes back, and then the next variable you need, so this is 5 BC, March 23rd, 5 BC. This is the death of Herod. Remember, Herod wanted to kill all the children because he heard that Jesus was born. So Jesus was born before whenever we decide the death of Herod was. I want to use this as the marker. The reason, and again, this is the grayness area. The reason Chadwick doesn't want to use this marker is if you look at seasons, under the Julian calendar, the equinox was changing. So what's that? Seasons. Equinox. So there is some debate about the precession of the equinoxes, and does that influence the actual equinox with the Gregorian calendar? But I found a PDF that puts March 23rd as the full moon of Nisan to start the Nisan period. And it says that it was after the It was before a full moon and after the Passover. But if you read some of the stuff online and read some of the Jewish tradition, the reasons to pick a Passover were a function of the astrology, but it was also a function of the time. The elders would say, "Oh, we're building a bridge here, and we could use another month before all these people pilgrimage into town and perform the Passover, so we're going to kick it back a month." Talk about arbitrary and capricious. And you can find some of that online. So we're in the ballpark in terms of the death of Herod. I want to say it was 5 BC. Right here. I want to say 7 BC, there's a supernova of some sort, something that's not in the astrological record that we have. What's interesting about this, when you look at the so-called history, I think this was Josephus, the historian that really has interesting background. Supposedly he was fighting with a bunch of Jews against the Romans. They all killed each other in some mutually agreed suicide in a cave, but 2 of them, including him, decided not to kill themselves and later survived. In another story, he had 3 friends that were being crucified, and he went to some Roman guy and begged, and they took him down, but 2 of them died, but 1 of them lived. And so when you talk about what's missing, he doesn't talk about lunar eclipses or comets. So what's missing with this historian is he only talks about 1 eclipse. And what I'm going to show you is Halley, the comet we attribute to Halley, came roaring by in Lehi's day, right before Yeshua was born. This is what Samuel the Lamanite saw. Where's the mention of it? The Chinese mention a comet in 12 BC and 5 BC. So when the Magi appear before Herod, and he's like, well, which sign in heaven are you referring to? There were so many signs. God was playing Herod. Herod was a bad man. He was being played. He tries to kill all these children. He sees this blood moon, and he dies. Why was he being played? Because he took the temple and reconstructed it. And he did it wrong. He did it how Mormons build temples. The temple was built on a bedrock. There was, in my opinion, an ancient megalith. If you look at the temple square where the Dome of the Rock is today, it's slightly askewed from east to west, and that means there could have been some earth activity that shifted it, which would tell us, if we knew what that earth activity was, when the lands moved so much that it shifted it from east to west, or they did their math wrong. So if east to west was calculated perfectly for the temple of Herod, and I'm going to use that phrase, it's not the temple of Jehovah that builded Herod, it's the temple of Herod, whereas I would call it the temple of Jehovah that builded Nephi or builded Solomon. It would have had to have been askew. It wouldn't have been perfectly east-west with a meridian. In the previous video, I talked about how you could put a pole in the ground, whether it's a maypole or an Asherah pole, study the shadows, and figure out perfect east-west, the meridian, based on where you are in the north, south, the meridian, the latitude. And I said it would take a year. It actually would take a day. You'd look for the minimum distance from the pole. When the sun is directly overhead, it minimizes the distance. That direction of that shadow, as long as you're not on the equator, there'd be no shadow. That direction of that shadow gives you north and south. And then if you can create a 90-degree angle, you got east and west. So when we look back at this, there's something hinky going on. The historians don't mention a comet that's obvious. Don't mention solar eclipses that are obvious, but just mentions this 1 eclipse, the death of Herod. And I think that's on purpose. It's showing that Herod was a bad guy. Jesus once said God is the God of the living, referring to being the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And the Hasmoneans, which were tied to Herod. Herod was doing all these building projects. He wanted to be shown as, I am the king of Israel, I guess. But south, there's a place called the Cave of the Prophets that he built this big fortress around. And the Muslims, when they went in and conquered Israel, or the Levant region, they didn't disturb this because it's about Abraham. And so it still exists today. You can go to the Cave of the Prophets. And so Yeshua later in life is mocking Herod a few ways. Once when he says, God is the God of the living, of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. There's a Cave of the Prophet with their dead bones there. And he's saying they're already living. And then he makes the comment about, in 3 days I can destroy this temple. When Herod died, the Western Wall wasn't complete. So the Western Wall has this megalithic stone structure that I think comes from the Philistine or grasshopper relationship-sized men. There's a really large structure. They could have moved it there. I'm not going to say they didn't have the technologies to do that. But from that, he built a platform. And on that platform, he built a larger version of the temple. On that platform. David's tabernacle, which is just down the hill, and has the sign of the compass on the, carved into the bedrock, was built on a threshing floor. And it was commanded of him. Solomon had the instruction on how he was supposed to build the temple. Nephi probably went to the temple with Lehi. They possibly were part of the renovation project as a family. But we know Nephi had the instructions on how to build a temple. So if we wanted to archaeologically find the temple of Nephi, we have the measurements. It's 2.5 by 1.5, I think, in proportion, or maybe 2 by 1.5. And it would be built on bedrock. So remember, no cut stone. The temple of Jehovah that builded Solomon had all this beautiful cut stone on the outside of the temple. The temple didn't have cut stone. And I don't know if they used cedar wood for the floor or just the ceilings to, create an aroma. But it was built on rock. A wise man builds your house upon the rock. And so the Mormons have no idea how to build a temple. They have no clue. What's interesting about the Mormons is they have all this hidden knowledge. Like I remember when the temple of Timpanogos was built, there was all this symbology about the number 7 in that temple. And there was a couple articles in the newspaper. Behind closed doors, these men are talking to architects and designers based on some documents or some knowledge they have to go about building these temples. That should be fully disclosed. It should be fully disclosed. So this 8 BC thing is pretty interesting to me. It could be the 8-7 BC problem because someone wasn't doing their math right. What's also interesting, you go to this year, for some reason the Bengali calendar is in sync with the 600-year cycle in 608 BC, or 8 BC. So then you take us to 608 BC. So this one should be the same if the math is right. Oh, they don't do it anymore. So this shows some of the story. This one's saying Halley's comet is 607 BC. I'm not buying that. And that's because I've done some research there. 12 BC is what most people say. There's a guy that's done some mathematical extrapolation. The problem with Halley's comet is it's ice and dust. It's probably shrinking over time, which slightly changes its orbit. Its orbit's 75 to 76 years. 75 times 8 is 600 years. 60 times 10 is 800 years. 50 times 12 is 800 years. There's lots of ways to get there. We have the years of Jubilee, the 50 years of the Hebrews times 12 is 600 years. You have, this concept of 60 from the Chinese times 10 gives you 600 years. And so the 60-year cycle is tied to the planet Venus, which is visible to the human eye. The Chinese did not use, as far as we understand, any sort of telescope. They used the human eye, because that would keep a consistent tracking of things. What is 60 years? Is it Venus? That's not 60 years. So one of the planets have an orbit that is tied either to 12 years, maybe it's 12 years. Let me pause for a second. Yeah, so it is Jupiter, and I don't know how visible Jupiter is. But this allows you to triangulate. It's not exactly 12 years, but about every 12 years. So with that information and your knowledge of the orbits of the sun, you can calculate time. So let's go back to his article. So the Chinese have this celebration on or about April 5. It's called the Queen Ming Festival. There's two stories about its derivation. One's really weird. It's about a man and his bondservant, and they're trapped somewhere, and the man is dying of starvation, so the bondservant lets him cut off some of his leg and eat it. And the tradition is the Chinese families visit the tombs to clean up the grave sites, to prepare the grave sites for the resurrection. Oh, look, the resurrection is coming. Two very different stories. Look at the timeline of it. And if you look at their words for it, do we have the words? This one says festival. We have several. Green blue water. Oh, thank you. Sunday Moon Day, which is a festival day. When they talk about the sun and the moon, they're talking about a festival. Remember, the sun is the greater light that rules the day, rules days, and the moon is the lesser light to rule the nights. And then after the Passover, because the event supposedly happened in the vigil of night, the Hebrews flipped the story. Genesis tells you the sun is the ruler. So now Raz is how it's pronounced. I didn't want to say it without pulling it up. So now Raz, I wonder if they oscillate between March 20th and 21st. Yeah, so they do an oscillation. The Russian Orthodox just decided to call it one of the days, like March 20th, with what's called the ecumenical. I don't know if that's what they call it. But that's what the Orthodox do, so it's not oscillating every time. And I've thought about that. I don't think you should oscillate the new year. You can let other things move. It might just be easier to say it's one day. But by using the actual equinox, which is what they're doing based on where they live, based on the meridian north where they live, which is easily defined with a pole and shadows, you can begin the year. And they weren't the only ones to do it. So going back to the Chinese, we now have sun and moon, so they're talking about the order of things, the yin and the yang. And now we have grass, line. Remember, line goes about vertical. And then we have this shape that looks kind of like a Hebrew shape for a house. There's variations of this. One looks like a square root sign, moral integrity. So we just have blue water in that. One of them has the meaning of bright lights. So these two should be the same. It's slightly different, that third symbol, but King Men, Ching Men should be very similar. Green blue water. This is the green blue water world. Sunday moon day, festival day. We have bamboo instead of grass. Remember, grass looks similar to that. We have lime. We now have pig snout. And pig snout, if we go through and do some of the analogies, pig snout is tied to the Holy Spirit, the walk in the Chinese language. And now we have. Just open the So now we have a hand, a pig snout, a cover, and a cloth to sweep. Oh, so this is the sweeping. So when a pig snout puts in her hand and covers her head to sweep the floor, pig snout's female. Earth, 10, grass, shell. Shell appears a lot, and we know that the ancient Americans would trade with seashells, like as a barter system or a credit system of some sort. And then we have the same word again. So the only word that changed here is this one. Look at Earth, look at 10. Look at your fingers, there's 10 fingers. 10 fingers with a line under them is the Earth. The plus sign and Earth sign is also means scholar, which is kind of interesting. I'm trying to decompose. So that should be 1, which it is. And this should be 10, but then we have different proportions of the cross. So 1 and 10. So 10 people put on Earth. 10 races, 10 nations, 10 trees or forests. Put on Earth is the meaning of Earth. Okay, so where we're going with all this is I'm going to put 5th or 6th people. 7th, whatever the year of the water ox. Now, ox is a very incorrect word. An ox is castrated. We don't know, or emasculated. We don't know if Yeshua was castrated or emasculated. They're called bullocks or wild bulls or young bulls. The Masoretic text really doesn't distinguish between them. So when Solomon dedicates the temple he built for Jehovah, it says, oh, we can't count how many. And this was just the king's offering. This wasn't people's offering. But it was basically 120,000 sheep. And if you divide that by 5, it was 20,000 ox. 120,000 sheep, 20,000 ox. I'm close to 140. So, if you can follow my logic, I'm building upon all this stuff all the academics are saying based on their limited understandings. But let's see if we can find 12 BC. hate using Halleys, but that's what we call them. Halley wasn't born when it was created. So we got 5 BC, some other broom comet described by the Chinese. And the Chinese are putting for his death date of May of 3180. I'm going to go plus or minus here, and there was a small eclipse that was described here. Let's see if I'm going to. So this, from a historical point of view, is useful. Some of these are actually. Let's see. This is the best video this guy. So, he understands the 9th of March of 5 BC. And remember, comets in the sky for Halley's the 5th of November, according to calculation. And let me put an anchor here of annual planet. And remember what he says, in 5 years. So there was a sign in heaven that's freaking people out. He's like, dude, Yeshua's going to be born in 5 years. And so part of my argument with the Chinese here is they were sweeping out the graves to celebrate the impending resurrection. So the idea of, and there's a link to a bright light here. So there is possibly in the record that we don't have some sort of supernova event. So for the Mormons, we believe that the supernova event would have occurred on a certain date in the Levant that it lit up the night sky until it appears day. And it could have been some sort of comet hitting the Earth's atmosphere and exploding like the Russian event. But it said the new star appeared. So that sounds like a supernova, based on what we have. So what I'm saying is you put those in between, and this is what's glorious. If you use my model, you got this broom comet, and then on 23 March, you can see you got a blip. And this I'm making some judgments. Is that right? 23 March BC. March 5 BC. Right over India. So, you could argue September of that same year, which would have been later, and then he died later. I like this verse for the story because, he died. He sees the moon and he died. There's some weird stuff about Herod and crucifying 5,000 men because people thought he had died. Something about a big Roman eagle in the temple to kind of mimic or mock the wind. There's some weird stories. How did the temple fall? We got 70 AD, the end of the temple. Some supposed dinner party, wrong Yeshua invited. I'm using Yeshua, I don't believe it was him, but someone named Yeshua invited. Ben Yeshua was invited, and Ben Yeshua came, and it created some conflict that created some conflict with the Romans, and they barred themselves in the temple or something. I don't know. You got to look at this history kind of with this blurred lens, because you can't read Josephus as a truth teller. He would have, where's the mention of this if he was a true historian? He mentions this. This is the only thing he mentions. And I could be getting wrong which historian. Remember, there's a man named, just for fun, a moron, and he tutelaged someone that might have been, based on his genealogy, moron, which gets used moron. Somehow there's an M and an R problem. Who then has a son called Moroni. Moron. He is the son of Moron. I believe, I'm being a little facetious. These are historians. Great battle warrior, But, you look at historians. Mormon was a historian. Read 3rd Nephi 8. Or 3rd Nephi, wherever he says, I am the descendant of Lehi. He was embarrassed that he was a descendant of Nephi. Nephi built the kingdom of heaven. So when Yeshua was here and prayed the Lord's Prayer, he didn't say, thy kingdom come. It's already here. Thank you, Nephi. Glory be to Nephi. And then Mormon later discovers the small place. And the words of Mormon, he says, I am the descendant of Nephi. He had a change of heart. He read something that changed his mind. Remember, Nephi, in less than 4 hours, cut a man's head off, possibly threw his body over the walls of the temple, put on his clothing, went and pretended to be someone else, probably loaded up a bunch of stuff out of the treasury, including the possessions that Laban had stole, plus the gold plates, put them on horses and camels. With the servant came out. It was probably a festival. It'd be really interesting to make a movie where it was somehow tied to one of the invasions, like there was a series of war going on, and we kind of snuck into this in the middle of the war, so if someone was dead on the street, it's like, oh, no big deal. We got a war going on. And so we don't even know if he didn't, what he loaded up out of the treasury. He lies, steals, kills in 4 hours' time. His concept of obedience was higher. I'm starting to think that sometime in the desert, he probably took on a South Arabian wife so that all of the seed of Abraham went to America. So that would have been descendants of Ishmael, descendants of Gideon, like Ishmael of Abraham offspring, which may have been tied to the Ishmael family that came. And when I mean descendants, you can include the women in understanding that genealogy. Abraham had 6 sons in Midian with another woman after his wife died. So this might have been how you named your child to demonstrate that you are pure blood. I am a descendant on my father's side of a moron, on my mother's side of a moron. In Spanish, we have why, and why, Rani, which in my opinion might have been Lehi's real name. He could be, I haven't figured this out, but like Amaron, would have been, I don't know if it's the father first or the mother first. So if I'm Moroni, I don't have to tell you my genealogy. I'm the son of that. So maybe it was Moroni. I don't know that genealogy. I've been noodling on it a bit. Okay, so I've read all the stories that the variable with the birth that a lot of people kind of get caught up into is the census, because we don't have any record, and this certain Roman soldier wasn't there until 1080 to create a census. So they're basing it on a census. I'm doing this as God is mocking Herod for his wickedness. And so some are going to talk about, well, when was the Passover? There's a seasoned PDF file that says, like in 600 BC, according to the Julian calendar, I guess, 30th of March was that calendar. And then, you can read some Jewish traditions on the Passover. Sometimes it was convenient that they went to the long date, April 17th, long date. They added the extra month. And sometimes those decisions were made within the month, not like the year before or whatever. And so this is my primary concern with Chadwick's work. So Chadwick's work is good. And let me finish with, he's doing 600 years. So this is the problem in Mormonism. You do math with what I gave you. Let's look at date time. Okay, so let's say you were born 1855. You died 26. There's a plus or minus a day. So, I was going to say 14,000 days. This is how old Joseph Smith lived. Okay, so one of us had as a template. And let's go back and I'm at 31 AD. Let's make sure that we capture this here on this guy. This was actually.
Here is a typical record in.
So I've read the 31 AD record in Chinese and Google Translate it. And it's kind of interesting because they're talking about a bunch of locusts and famines and a bunch of Gadianton type robbers. I think they're battling in their country. So here's the 31 AD. And it's going to throw off a lot of things. So what I'm doing is I'm backing up and saying, whoa, as historians, we have bias. Back up. I'm using a reference from China. A third witness outside of the Judeo-Christian blur. That's how we're going to uncover the truth, but it's going to be difficult because a lot of what we uncover is going to be challenging. Okay, so anyway, so now we're going here, and this is where we're going to conclude with this kind of introduction on this. So you do the math, 7 BC to 31 AD. Where's 31 AD? Or to May 11th. Oh, there it is. Let's put that. And so there's some of you watching this going, you're wrong. The Book of Mormon says. Okay. So you do some math. And so when you talk about the translation process, I'm more of a believer of this lawyer suggesting the seer stone in the hat was a demonstration. It got him in trouble because Hiram and David Whitmer, Hiram Page, married one of the Whitmer girls. David Whitmer both had seer stones. Hiram translated something with the seer stone. Joseph made him destroy the seer stone and burn the papers. Okay, Joseph, that's not correct. That's C scholarship for that. You don't burn anything. The glory of God is intelligence. We're not afraid of anything. But somehow some of these secrets that Joseph was passing around got interpreted by Brigham and others to mean we need to have Danites and secret oaths. Go around threatening and killing people. Okay, so the solar eclipse, there was a date there, and again, there's a little bit of noise because someone's translating the calendar of the Chinese based on their kings, based on whether they did a session or non-accession in their counting of years, blah, 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 blah. But the translation process, you've got to put in context the testimonies of translation when they were born. 1880s, Whitmer and Emma are talking about, the Salamander letter scandal is coming out, so they're talking about how the translation worked. You got to fillet the fish. Put in order every record we have of how the translation process worked. Joseph communed with Jehovah. Jehovah's like, hold my beer, hold my root beer. He's not relying on the telephone game on his side. He's talking directly to Joseph. Joseph's not a great reader. There's not words appearing in there that Joseph has to constantly read. It would take him all day. Joseph is a conversationalist. He heard the words of Jehovah. He spent the rest of his life trying to find a smart man that somehow had those personality characteristics. He went with John C. Bennett, which was a waste of time. The closest he came, he named one of his sons after. I'm trying to remember his name. The one that died of the lung disease and studied ancient maps. So after he writes the Book of Mormon, he's studying geography to try to figure out what he wrote. He heard a voice. And the voice at times would correct the scribes through Joseph. Joseph was just kind of the vehicle of the voice. And this voice had to be perfect because the voice has to translate it into a word perfectly designed for Joseph's day, based on understanding all of what Nephi or whoever was speaking was saying and meaning. So the translation process. So, this gets us the problem of 33 or 34. So remember, Joseph's father was a Mason for a long time, Oliver Cowdery, Royal Scouts. I think he's the word scoundrel, tricky or something in the sky. Oliver would sneak in changes, contrary to what Joseph wanted. And so, what was really going on with the translation process? They lost some of the manuscript. It was a big deal. But even so, people would come over to the house, look at a page of the manuscript. They were able to copy it down and send it out to people. When the church was organized, there weren't 6 members. That was the official contractual organization. David Whitmer said there was already 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 members, some big number. Because what they were doing is they were scribbling this down and showing these pages to people. Like, oh my gosh. And people were joining the church based on the story of angels. These words that were coming out. So there's so much that needs to come out. So Skousen, I like Skousen. I thought he was really Cleone's nephew or something. So Skousen makes it very clear that we need to read that in the New Testament. He doesn't say forgive 70 times 7. He says forgive 77 times. Based on the actual language. So that's where we're going to finish. And say, what? So Joseph is dictating something and says a year. And Oliver's like, dude, it can't be that year. It's got to be this year. They probably had a debate. And maybe some of these times led to fist fights. I don't know if Oliver was a fighter like some of Joseph's brothers, but, there was debate. You can't say that, Joseph. In our Christian tradition, we know Jesus was 33 years old. He was a 33-degree Mason, or whatever, however that ties. And so, this is the idea of, burying the talent in the sand. You got to rip it apart. And, Rough Stone Rolling does a pretty good job. Just kind of locked in like Chadwick to the, those traditions of academic historians. So, let's go to the original manuscript. They don't have it online. You can buy a book. So I don't know how many cross-offs are there. All I can go is based on the 10th edition. Printers, manuscripts. And it's great that they put this online. It needs to be searchable. So, like, if I wanted to search for Shazer right now, just jump to Shazer. They've got to do some manual work. They have lots of other people that can do this. Okay, so is this the papers? Book of Mormon manuscript. Printer's edition. 1823. Okay, so now I just want to type in 3 Nephi and hit enter. And it's 8. So this other thing about taking the chapter, Harley, I think, did it, taking the chapters 25, creating his own versification, chapterification. What is going on? Yeah, so that's not. So this was the original chapter 8, which later got versified to that. Okay. So now I gotta scroll all the way through this again. And it came to pass. We kept a record. So I could be wrong. Okay, here we go. It came to pass in the 34th years. It came to pass. Something. Where am I looking? Our time of reckoning. Came to pass according to the time of our reckoning. A little bit less. I'm going to zoom in about there. And it came to pass that. So what was that? This was a